Good afternoon. I hate to interrupt a fruitful conversation, and my public speaking advice always said, picture your audience being amazing public servants, including your favorite author, and some of your personal heroes, including the Oracle, including Don Wright, who's done a great job covering the Central Valley's water issues, and Don Cameron, Felicia Marcus. It's so humbling to be here. As you can tell, I'm usually the person behind the desk, not on the mic. So my name's Lee Bernacki. I am so grateful that the Bill Lane Center for the West and our friends at Stanford decided to bring the Rural West Conference here to talk about climate change and water and the people who are affected by it. I can't thank the Maddie Institute enough for being great partners across all the institutions that they're at, including UC Merced. And Fresno State has always been a leader in agriculture, and they're just a generous and thoughtful partner, especially Dean Ram Nuna and farmer and professor Walter Mizuno, who's also here. They're just the trusted ag leaders. So I'm really grateful to talk about ag innovation and sustainability here. I'm joined by wonderful colleagues from UC Davis and UC Merced and Nitricity, an exciting ag innovation group. And before I do formal introductions, I'll give you a quick update on F3 Innovate, and I'll introduce some of the work that we're doing. So as I said, my name's Lee. I've been at UC Merced for 9 years, but before that, my great grandpa had a Madera meat market. He's really proud of my vegetarianism now. My grandma picked onions as an Okie. My dad knocked almonds. You'll notice we call them that because it's up north where they started. I was born in Fresno, raised in Mariposa, and now I get to see the University of California, Merced, grow. It has doubled in size since I started there. It is the first American research university of the 21st century, and it is stressed out right now. So call your Congress members. And then the reason I do this work is because I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I can't imagine the climate future she is going to inherit. And so all of our work is dedicated to climate smart agri-food technology. And I like to think about the 6 generations after Phoebe and how they're going to live and have food in the future. So here's the 5 things we did this week. Farms Food Future, many of you were instrumental in getting this funded. It is the largest federal grant ever awarded to the Central Valley. It is the largest one out of the Biden Build Back Better Regional Challenge. So it was a huge investment in agricultural innovation. And it brings together many different partners from Fresno to Merced, but all across the valley. And it is funded by the Economic Development Agency and supported by California Department of Food and Agriculture. So we've changed our names a few times, but it's Farms Food Future, F3. That pretty much covers it, and it covers the whole food system. There's a place for everyone in F3. If you want to get involved, please let me know. We all eat here, so maybe you only fit into the consumer part, but I think we're all involved in agriculture in other ways. And what we're trying to do differently is create an inclusive innovation environment that supports the agricultural system. Venture capital is not going to do it. Venture funds have dropped 50% since 2019, and they are not interested in investing in the beautiful, diverse, and delicious food system that we have in the Central Valley and the technology needed to support it. The gains are too small. There's no unicorn in a off-ground harvester for almonds like Dr. Hassani will talk about. The gains are not great enough, so we need to have public and coordinated investment in our innovation system, and that will enable more people to benefit from our agricultural system. So let me talk about some of the key players in our food system. From day one, we did something totally different. We asked farm workers, what do you want to be when you grow up? There's more research on prisons and education systems because we think that people will actually get out of prison. We don't think that farm workers will stop being farm workers. Sit on that for a minute. We asked them, hey, what keeps you from learning? What keeps you from growing? 11,000 farm workers told us, I'm interested in agriculture. 15% of them said that, but I'd also like to learn how to read. I'd like to learn how to get an email address. I'd like to be able to support my kids as they learn on Zoom. I'd like to learn on Zoom from home. They are closer to the problem and closer to the solution. And so if we don't focus on farm workers as being a critical component of the food system that will help us adopt innovation and technology and make better practices, then we are missing a whole swath of diversity and great solutions. So to meet those goals that they ask for in education, we suggest investment in computers, childcare. Minor investments will make huge changes. We have a CBE, competency-based education certificate in agricultural technology. It's available at 7 community colleges from Merced, Madera, Clovis, Fresno, Reedley, Lemoore. And if you don't have it at one of those, let us know, we can bring it to you. And that is meant for farm workers to get credit for the ag knowledge that they have and get better paying jobs if they want to stay in agriculture. So this is a huge program. It's never happened like this through the community college system. Please hire folks from this program. And if you'd like to get involved in the next classes they could take, please reach out. What's at stake with climate change is, as I mentioned, our diverse and delicious food system. I don't want to live in a world without a California peach. I don't know who does. And we need to support those smaller cropping systems, including the beautiful, bitter, high fiber jujube. As an example of the food processors that we're supporting, we've invested in community kitchens in Fresno so you can salsa your own salsa, jam your own jam. You want to start a small business around food, you have a certified place to do that. We've also invested in, how cool is this? A try it before you buy it rental program for ag tech so that you can use technologies before you invest in them. It's based at Kearney, about 20 miles south of here, so that small farmers can adopt technology and de-risk that adoption so that more people have labor-saving devices, cleaner, healthier jobs for processing. Sometimes you need to invent new tools. So we've partnered with UC Ag and Natural Resources and F3 Local to implement some of our inclusive innovation practices. That means that you start first with the problem and the people who will be affected by the technology and who stand to benefit and who is at risk from it. So jujube farmers brought to us a need to expand their market by preserving the fruit, and that means you have to de-pit it. There is not currently a local de-pitter of jujubes, but we are inventing one with a diverse group of mechanical engineers at UC Merced, and their goal is to make it affordable, low energy, low cost, accessible, manufactured locally, adaptable to other crops. What else can we de-pit? And multi-scale so that many people could use this tool over the short harvest. I want to highlight that the benefit to the Valley of investing in our talent and providing ag tech opportunities will be greater schools, greater investments in education, better sustainability. If you retain the talent at Fresno State and UC Merced and all the community colleges, then they will stay here and invest in our communities. 1,000 computer science engineers at UC Merced, and I'm slowly, one by one, converting them to the idea that their future's not at Facebook, it's in farming. Let's stop putting ads in front of people's faces and feed them instead. So we try to give them opportunities for inclusive innovation, and this is the expansion of that ecosystem to retain, train, and retrain the magical talent that is available. Lastly, I'll say that California is currently a net exporter of our food products. Everyone eats here, but not everyone uses our technology. We import a lot, and I think that instead of, if we think of jazz and ag tech, we can make the horn and manufacture it here, but we could also write the music and have it played across other climate analogs. So over the years, we've been inviting folks to campus, trying to learn from Dutch dairy people, Belgian biogas folks, Mexican tequila folks, and no, I didn't get to sample it. We have been trying to build a relationship across the planet for a food secure valley. Okay, my last slide here is that we're all actors in the food system. The wonderful Dr. Kimberly Gibson, will you please wave, is leading some research on inclusive innovation. We'd love for you to participate, not while Dr. Visser is speaking, please, but she's happy to give you a card. We want to build a stronger ecosystem here. We all benefit from a inclusive innovation approach. We can't keep doing what we're doing, and you all probably have ag expertise. So thank you for your attention. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Visser, who's amazing. She is a professor of community and regional development in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of California, Davis, that other ag school. She is the principal investigator of the UC's multi-campus research program on labor and automation in California agriculture. I'm listening. And the chair of the United States Department of Agriculture multi-state project entitled Building Sustainable and Resilient Systems in Rural America, Transformative Responses to Disruption. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Leah, thank you for that generous introduction, and to Stanford for inviting me back to my alma mater, which I come to quite frequently. I did both my undergraduate and graduate work here before leaving the state briefly to get my PhD and returning to work at UC Davis. I grew up in Sanger, about 25 miles west of here, actually a small unincorporated area outside of Sanger called Centerville. So my interest in promoting rural economies and prosperities, both from a local and also regional development perspective, is a cause near and dear to my heart. As Lee mentioned, I have been for the last couple years involved in this question of if ag tech, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, is going to revolutionize the food system and agricultural enterprises and productions and economies. What does that actually mean? How do we prepare our labor forces, our workspaces, our policy systems to encounter this innovation? How do we anticipate for something coming in to disrupt, good and bad, a system that has been in place for a long period of time, and a system in which land has been created around? And so I'm trained as both an anthropologist and an economist, which, depending on who introduces me, makes me either a political scientist or a sociologist. But basically, I'm one of those scholars that understands the power of large numbers and models and the importance of understanding the local context which shape those broader factors that we understand. And as a scholar, I've committed myself to trying to explain that meso-level interaction across the board. Pointer. So I want to take just a minute. In the two big research initiatives on which I am a part, we do a variety of research. So we have been charged with looking at how these forces are reshaping labor systems and agricultural workspaces across the agri-food system. We were given a small investment with the charge of leverage this for more economic resources. So in 2019, we received $4 million from the UC and the state of California. That has since been leveraged to incorporate over $35 million towards this research initiative. It has also helped us create a different type of workforce, and that is the scholars and researchers needed to usher in and support this transition. And I just want to take a moment to give a shout out. I have 4 of my current members of my research team here with me today. I'm going to make you raise your hand. Jordan, raise your hand. Jordan, Julia, Alex. And we also have the opportunity to do a lot of international collaborations. And Monia is visiting us here from the University of Bonn through the Germany exchange program, helping to get us at these questions. So I just wanted to give them a shout out because they come along with me to orchards and fields, and you can see some of our workplaces here, trade shows, harvesting alongside workers, and also working in packing houses and warehouses. So before I begin, I want to make sure we have a common vocabulary. Scholars have a way of throwing out words and then just being like, so you got it, right? When I'm talking about ag tech, I'm actually talking about a process and host of tools that have ranged from automation to digitization that have sought to try to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency and the productivity of agricultural food systems and workspaces across the agri-food system. And so you can think of them as being kind of 3 primary types of tech: automation, digitization, that's those AI tools, the sensors, the robotics, sometimes what we often think of when somebody throws out the word ag tech, but it also includes a form of platformization. So sort of the data centers that help to try to connect farmers and other agricultural users and stakeholders with information to help to make their products and connect them with other services and markets more productive and efficient. Now, ag tech is not new. This has been something that has been occurring for quite a while in agriculture. And a lot of this has come from the industrial idea, which has shaped sort of our modern understanding of the industrialization of agriculture in general and throughout the 20th century. So much like we saw in industries like manufacturing, there was a conceptualization that we could make agriculture very much more like a factory type production line. So harnessing mechanization, technology, and advancing ideas of large farms to help improve productivity and profits for this industry and sector. And throughout the 20th century, we saw agriculture undergo dramatic change with new elements of production coming in, the rise of agricultural experts, all of us on this stage, economists, engineers, technologists, the rise of new material vehicles of change, particularly the tractor and the Excel book, beginning the foundations for the technologicalization of this industry, and the notion of a farm as a factory and a farmer as a businessman. And the most important thing to understand, as my friend Dr. Fitzgerald at Harvard did in her wonderful history of trying to interrogate this question, was, could every farm become a factory? She said, we have largely missed that. We've basically realized that farming is an ecosystem, but that there are myriad of intentions and actors coming to shape this space, both internal and external, and there always has been. So this is just to give you an idea. The modern industrial idea also gave us our current food chain, which Leah also presented. This is a very simplified understanding of that. And it also shaped the landscapes of agriculture throughout most of the 20th century. And then at the end of the 20th century to the current time we are in now, agriculture has also undergone another transition, a period that many scholars refer to as agriculture 4.0. And this is creating new economic landscapes throughout rural communities and agricultural economies. We've seen the rise of private equity and venture capital in this space, increased regulation, environmental challenges, workforce changes, including an increasingly aging workforce, the increased volatility and uncertainty of being integrated into global markets, as well as local shocks, which can impact crop production, the rise in conglomeration and consolidation, challenging small family farms, and of course, across the nation, this is all happening within the intersection of a tremendous effort to disrupt agriculture for good and bad. And much like the previous system, we too also have a diverse array of intentions, underscoring the motives of these actors in these systems. So this is just a very simplified attempt of me and my colleagues trying to map out what the current food system looks like in the digital era. The most important thing you can take from this diagram is that today's agri-food system is increasingly complex. It's multidimensional, interdependent, interconnected with a large number of actors and a diverse array of tech. At the same time, most of our work has focused on the production side in the last couple of years. So we have been deeply embedded in local communities and on farms to try to understand how this is impacting farming enterprises. So we talk about the ag tech ecosystem. Lee mentioned that itself. And the important thing to know is that today's modern farm workplace is a very diverse place. There's a host of actors in this ecosystem seeking to impact both labor processes and labor outcomes on US farms. There is also an enormous amount of actors and processes seeking to impact economic outcomes in these regional economies. This creates the problem of what we call a polycentric governance system. And that is when you basically have a very complex interdependent system with lots of different centers of decision making, all seeking to impact some aspect of this reality. And each have centers of power to some degree, meaning they can operate with autonomy to influence processes. But at the same time, there's an incredible amount of degree and complexity with oftentimes choices and decisions being made by companies or farmers impacting the overall outcome and trajectory of economic growth. Now, ag tech, despite this ecosystem, has been suggested to have an enormous amount of benefits for economic development. The five listed up here are important. We've talked about them today. It has also been identified as having numerous challenges as well. Some real, some invented, a lot not ground truthed yet in the agri-food system. But we know that research does suggest this can increase and reinforce inequalities in terms of access to value chains and productions for certain producers. It does have some impacts on some labor force, although what these exactly are do vary, and we are awaiting strong evidence on this. It has the capacity to concentrate power to off-farm actors. And of course, there is the real validity of the startup financing structure, which Lee pointed out too. And that is that if we are going to sort of reshape local economies and resiliencies around the promises of startups, which may go out of business overnight, what does that mean? And so, from an economic development perspective, local planners in this area, and particularly agricultural actors, have to sort of navigate what I call the triad. This is different than traditional economic development, which is often focused on entrepreneurial action and industrial recruitment. When you are faced with a situation in which a disruption may come from afar, such as technological innovation, you must be able to navigate different aspects of this. Layer that on the reality that agricultural economies are very complex social ecological systems that are composed of multiple value systems, actors, community networks, and natural and human systems. They're all interdependent, they're all complex, they all impact one another, and they are particularly important when economic change comes to rural areas, such as when a disruption or shock comes in, as this can influence how communities adapt at multiple scales. And so, in looking at this question, we set out through this research over the last couple of years. I've been asked to give a very broad, high level overview of what we find. So, we're going to give some key insights into the real politic of ag tech economic development, getting at the question of what does this look like on the ground? Who are the actors? What are the pragmatic realities of this? Looking at the adaptive institutional context, it's how is this network of actors interacting with one another to shape adaptive capacity? And then ultimately, how do you improve regional innovative capacity for regions? So to let you know where we're pulling from, we've been doing a lot of work. We've been a lot of places. This is a qualitative study, ethnographic in nature, but we have over 1,500 observations, more interviews, more data sets than I can name by number. But just to give you an example, I'm only going to talk about the findings we have pulled from these three crop sectors. And I'm going to hyper focus on the West. And then also, though, we're happy to talk about, in passing, I or my students who are engaged on this project, issues of livestock. So we've done dairy and cattle as well. But we're going to focus primarily on perennial and row crops today. So let's start. Let's get to this. What is the real politic of ag tech development on the ground? Well, not surprisingly, if we know that for agricultural economies, there are importance of interactions and dependencies between a variety amount of actors, then a lot of this comes down to how do local economies, often within a regional approach, manage the response to ag tech in a changing agricultural economy. And so the first thing to notice is there's sort of three institutional realities. Those are the first three up on the slide. And there's three sort of strategies or tactics. The first reality is, of course, the myriad of human intentions. These actors engage in this area for various reasons. The second is this notion of the polycentric system of governance, which is an incredibly complex system to try to manage and drive in a uniform situation. There are many benefits to it. The high flexibility allows for quick adaptation. But some of the challenges include high transaction costs for coordination, the conflict and gridlock due to diverse interests, accountability challenges, risk of elite capture by certain actors in the system, of course, uneven participation from different groups, and of course, complex power dynamics that occur in rural areas. And what we find is that key to the real politic of ag and economic development is collaboration. This is something that is the theme of the day. But it is also a collaboration with the opportunity to be able to build and maintain that and reinforce that when the collaboration goes awry. And so we like to call it the carrots and the sticks. A lot of it is the social power or social trust and the cultural norms to shape those discussions. And of course, the flexibility of policy responses, not just as it relates to economic development, but everything from tax incentive and tax structures to workforce development and education systems to actually supporting and understanding research and R&D on farms and in orchards. So knowing this, we get to the question of adaptive capacity. And I'm not going to be able to go through everything today. I am writing a book. It should be out later. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that during the break or after the conference. But I'm going to focus on two elements of this, and I'll let you read this slide for yourself. But so adaptive capacity. When we're talking about adaptive capacity, this is very important for building economic development systems that can withstand any type of shock, economic, environmental, technical. So the adaptive capacity refers to the ability for rural and local regional economies to adjust and respond to changing circumstances at any level by leveraging economic resources, technology, and institutions and the structures to minimize the negative impacts and to capitalize off emerging opportunities for growth. So key to this is the first bullet point, and that is this idea of the endogenous model of economic development. What that means is that every economy and industry that we have looked at that has been successful in this space prioritizes an endogenous model to economic development. They don't know they're doing this. But essentially, this is extreme investment into actors that are internal to the economy. And that means innovation on farms throughout the systems and communities, human capital accumulation through education and knowledge creation, rather than relying on the external forces to bring the tech to them. And so what this does is through this push for collaboration, it allows for an anchor institution to emerge and guide this collaborative force. Now, I like to call the anchor institutions the accidental economic developers because they're usually never a traditional economic developer association involved in sort of policy and decision makings or land use planning. And they take a variety of forms. They can be nonprofit organizations, they can be universities, they are often commodity boards, but my favorite from our field of research has been the Washington Tree Fruit Research Commission. They are a team of horticulturalists and plant geneticists who got involved in the question of tech and economic development about 4 years ago, utilizing and leveraging the trust that they have built with growers by helping to address things like cotton moth and little cherry disease. They were able to bring a variety of actors to the table to build a regional vision for technology, identifying it with a roadmap that laid out 3, 5, and 10 years across the industry, beginning with apples, and now they have existed and extended across other industries, knowing that there is an industry-specific reality to the development of ag tech. And then ultimately, the point is that through the collaboration and by using this roadmap to shape technological innovation, when ag tech companies come, farmers and growers in the region, as well as the Research Commission and economic development actors, can first ask, have you seen our roadmap? How does it fit? And are you ready to show us how your tool matches the needs of our industry? And so that leads it to the idea of innovative capacity. Now, when you get to the question of building innovative capacity for a region, you're talking about building the ability of internal innovation networks to exploit existing resources and create a sustainable competitive advantage for a region by driving innovation activities in constantly changing environments. And so they do this through a variety of things. I'm happy to talk about any of these in the question and answer session. I am going to focus on two very quickly, and that is how do you align R&D that is occurring? And then ultimately, how do you encourage farm innovation? So the first thing, the question to aligning ag tech R&D needs, and what I love about these sort of applied strategies that we find in the field, is it allows for an understanding of where can you invest. And these investments aren't huge in reality, but they are incredibly informative, particularly for production enterprises in the system. And so with the capacity to focus limited time and resources, particularly in some industries in rural areas, by aligning your research design and ag tech by supporting things like the roadmap, like the Washington Tree Fruit Research Commission did and other industries and commodity boards have followed, they're able to identify what ag tech needs are of their growers in the area. Also through collaborative establishments with agencies and sometimes working farms, but oftentimes educational institutions, these commodity boards and industry sectors will create smart farms, smart orchards, very smart fields. What is this? These are testing beds, generally located on working farms so that ag tech companies can come in, test their instruments and their technology quickly, efficiently. And usually there is one key thing that the industry actors will say if you want to engage on this farm. And ultimately, it is sort of an entrance gate to show your ag tech for the industry. And that is, we welcome all types of ag tech, so long as you share your data with us. And from that comes the capacity for the region and the industry to anticipate things like success, profitability, use for the industries and growers. And the best collaborative networks are able to extend this out to growers and it sort of allow this information to exist and go beyond just one actor or even just a research commission. And so the second thing that we find is the importance of farm innovation. And that is that if your producers, and this is true across the ag food system, if your producers and your workspaces are not ready for this tech, that tech can be quite disruptive. Now, I want to give you an example of what that means. So it's not as if, like we saw in other industries like manufacturing, it is likely not that ag tech will come in overnight and dramatically change workplaces within a day or two. We will be able to see some of these transformative technologies come, but the question is that if you're not ready for them, they can have extremely devastating impacts on industries. And so when we're talking about farm innovation, we're talking about orchard renewal, field renewal, ideas for planting on farms themselves. I give the example of the tree fruit industry here for a variety of reasons. There has been enormous innovation in the tree fruit orchard over the last 10 years, changing the ways trees grow, trying to harness water, trying to harness shade to get that perfect apple. And yet at the same time, we're beginning to see clear advancements in labor efficient technologies such as platforms, as well as a harvester possibly on the horizon in about 20 years, they like to say. But what that means is that you have to get an orchard ready. A traditional apple orchard isn't set up for a platform. It has to be built and grown in a specific way. Sure, that's great. Well, think about this. It also takes about 7 years to get an apple orchard to a productive level. It also requires reinvestment in costs, which at a time in agriculture where capital is very tight, this is very hard to do. And so some of the best examples we've seen throughout the United States are industry and community-based approaches, which are trying to leverage a complex system of policy mixes, plus extension mixes, plus leveraging all types of community organizations. So this includes promoting reinvestment by allowing tax write-offs for innovation purposes into orchards, tree removal programs in some industries as well as enterprise planning. So assisting farmers with looking at budgets and planning for how do you get ready for an orchard in 5 to 7 years, and also how do you get ready to plan for something that may emerge but may not actually emerge as it is right now. And so it allows for that flexibility of thinking, which is required for that long-term planning and budgeting. And so having traveled a lot all over the country and having some opportunities to travel internationally as well, we have become quite concerned with our insights for California on the ag tech issue. We have a lot of innovation and promise. But the one thing that we have learned in the 7 years we've been involved in this is there is no panacea to ag tech economic development. There is no one size fits all approach. The most successful ones we have seen are sector-based, industry-based, and locality specific, but with the capacity to speak to regions. We also know that the ecological and the technological, what ultimately gets adopted on farms and throughout the system, is influenced as much by the social and the institutional as it is the economic. And so you have to be able to link those realities together as you try to think about how are you going to build an economy around these tools. We know, and Lee mentioned this, the diversity and complexity of California farms, particularly in the Central California, do create an issue for some of the ag tech companies and the ag tech technology that is emerging, particularly those that are based on sort of a notion of monoculture or large scale farms that can take on very large robotic hardware and software, sensors and machines. And that may not work for many farms in California. It often doesn't work for small farmers either. So that creates the opportunity for a variety of realities, but it also underscores a true common reality. And I'm going to wrap up with this slide. And that is that California ag, as it relates to the space and the rural and regional communities that are dependent on agriculture and for tech, will require a unique and specific plan. Again, there is no panacea, but I've become increasingly vocal about the need for a moonshot for California's agriculture economies. Many of you think of the moonshot, you can think of examples. Kennedy's call to have us go to the moon, the cancer moonshot of 5 to 6 years ago. But really, a moonshot doesn't necessarily have to be broad investments either. It's just a plan. And so what we do know from our research is there are 7 key tenets to make this plan great. And I know we're going to have an opportunity to talk about it. Most importantly, and I'm going to highlight the 2 at the bottom, for California, this plan is going to have to support an ag tech portfolio of development that can serve diversified farming enterprises. So technology that can be scaled up and down for the types of farm workers that we have. And we are also going to have to continue to identify areas of competitive advantage for small and medium-sized enterprises as these new tools come in. That's everything from identifying new markets to identifying ways of producing goods in agriculture to organizing labor forces and ultimately to support workers in these systems as well. And so with that, I'm happy to yield the time. Sorry for taking a little bit more, but there's a QR code here. You can follow all of our updates as we take out our research, as well as find our contact information and also the emerging research from our student team as well. So thank you.
Who would like to take Dr. Visser's class? Okay, and who's going to help author the California Agriculture Technology Moonshot? Mr. Cameron, would you like to help? Just kidding. I love that plan and amazing. Our next speaker is exactly a model of what we're hoping for in this ag tech innovation ecosystem. Dr. Josh McEnany is the president and chief technology officer of Nitricity. It is a plant-based, climate-smart fertilizer company that's based in Fremont, California, that other valley, and is brought to the San Joaquin Valley with some production in Fresno, California. Can't wait to hear. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Josh McEnany. I'm the president and CTO and one of the co-founders at Nitricity. We make a climate smart fertilizers with air, water, and renewable electricity, and lately biomaterials. We've been making an organic fertilizer. We're going to be building our first plant in Delhi, California, and I'm going to dive into a little bit of why our fertilizer is sustainable and how we fit into sustainable ag in general and regenerative ag. Particularly with an emphasis on climate change and fertilizers. So as we all know, nitrogen fertilizer is essential. With no fertilizer application, you can versus fertilizer application with nitrogen fertilizer, you can see a 70% or more increase in yields. Some places around the world don't have access to fertilizer. We are fortunate to have a good amount of access to fertilizer in the US and California. However, it's important to food supply costs and national security. If you don't have access to this, it becomes a critical thing for your country to have this fertilizer in order to allow your crops and fields to be productive and feed your population. The price, unfortunately, is tied to fossil fuels and global supply chains. So we've had some pretty significant volatility when we've had the war in Ukraine, other global impacts, COVID. We've seen this in fertilizer prices and natural gas booms and busts. Then the production and application cause huge greenhouse gas emissions. So some of you may know that's production of ammonia and nitric acid amount to about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions because it's tied to fossil fuels. But one that's not as touted is these fertilizer application emissions. When you're actually over applying fertilizer to the fields, it'll turn into nitrous oxide. That's really bad greenhouse gas, 300 times worse than CO2. What the goal is really to get the fertilizer into the crop, not have it turn into this really bad greenhouse gas. So we've been following 3 global trends. I mentioned these volatile prices tied to natural gas and global supply chain demands. But as the population grows, so does our need for fertilizer. And as the renewable energy revolution continues to make low-cost electrons with solar, wind, we're certainly interested in hydro and nuclear as well, to just have carbon-free sources of electricity so that we can make our fertilizer with that. So our mission is to electrify and distribute fertilizer production. So California imports an enormous amount of its fertilizer. We want to make that fertilizer here and more locally near where the farms are using it to decrease global GHG emissions by about 5% by improving the sustainability of fertilizer production and application. And to make it more sustainable and generally increase access to it as we expand in further regions of the world. In addition, there's challenges in organic farming with nitrogen fertilizer. So organic farming has a lot of benefits. You can have lower pesticide use and not as many harmful chemicals applied to your fields, perhaps. But fertilizer is a particular challenge because you're stuck with either manure or fish parts, these like really odorous, pathogen-containing, not very irrigable sources, or else they're very expensive if they are irrigable. So we have a plan to fix that issue, if I can. And that's with our fertilizer. So we make a 3% N, what's called an ash tea. So we take almond shells and produce a fertilizer, returning those nutrients to the soil with air, water, renewable electricity, and almond shells in this case. So it's 100% plant-based. It provides a reliable nitrogen fertilizer that's fully irrigable, doesn't have the odor problems of chicken manure and fish emulsion. And then it has a very low GHG profile. So we make it's all electrified. We use renewable or carbon-free electricity to make the product. And then when you apply it, I'll get into why that is a much lower application emissions as well. Showing our process a little bit, taking the almond shells, putting it through our electrified high temperature process to extract the nutrients. We can make a fully aqueous irrigable nitrogen fertilizer that goes back onto the fields. To dive into the chemistry, I know we've got some scientists here. My background is in chemistry. We can basically divide fertilizers into 2 categories: ammonia-based fertilizers or nitrate-based fertilizers. So ammonia-based fertilizers, in here we've included urea and manure because they break down to form ammonia. Typically have a pretty low global nitrogen utilization efficiency. Less than 50% of the fertilizer, the nitrogen atom, actually gets into your crop. Whereas nitrates, if you apply them through fertigation and like drip irrigation, you can get up to 95% nitrogen utilization efficiency. So much less of it is wasted and going into rivers and streams and greenhouse gases. The nitrates can be very fast absorbing. There's a single path to make greenhouse gases, which I'll show on the next slide, because there's an opportunity for an 80% reduction in application emissions. And then it's fully irrigable, so you can do more control. The high frequency fertigation is what a lot of farms are moving to, so that you can really maximize the nutrients and chemical use in your crops. One more step into the chemical deepness. We've got manure and fertilizer or nitricity solution here. These ammonia-based inputs end up going through this whole process of being converted by microbes into nitrates first, and then being uptaken by the crop. You can get some uptake from ammonia, but it's much more frequent to happen through this nitrate path. And that conversion of ammonia to nitrate releases about 1% of the time this nitrous oxide greenhouse gas. So if you can remove that path, you have this other path. Once you have nitrate, you can make some nitrous oxide, but you don't have this path to make nitrous oxide anymore. So that's that 80% reduction right there. As long as you're getting most of your nitrogen into your crop, you can minimize this nitrous oxide emission. So ultimately, this leads to a life cycle analysis where we show that our ash tea can reduce by over 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions between production and application, as well as distribution. In the case of certain fertilizers that are being shipped from overseas, you get a lot of distribution emissions too. So diving in on our company path a little bit, we've started in Stanford, where in my postdoc we were working on a couple of different technologies, and ended up developing a different one in my backyard in East Palo Alto. But then during COVID, we moved down to Fresno State and got a grant from the Wet Center and got involved with the Valley Ventures and built a system at the irrigation center down in Fresno State. So that really got us started. We grew some processing tomatoes, shows that the technology generally worked for growing these crops, and then got connected with Don Cameron, who's going to be on our next panel. He helped us to get a system set up down in his farm in Terra Nova in Helm, California. You can see that farm here. Built up about 50 kilowatts of solar power, as well as this system here that generated some fertilizer that went out to the crop, out to the fields. We ended up ripping it up and redeveloping it in San Francisco so that we could get more efficient production. And now this is just making solar power for Don. But we've since developed that process quite a bit. Had another pilot system in Fremont that's been working really well. And been able to make tonnage of the fertilizer at this point. So we've secured 5 years of offtake agreements for our next plant, which we're going to be developing, as I mentioned, in Delhi, California. And we're really excited. We've got some partnerships with Chipotle and other growers and farms in the area that are going to be taking this fertilizer. So once we build that plant this year, the goal is to then build several more than in California, Washington, and Arizona areas, as well as around the US, and then followed by Europe has a pretty good, very good sized organic farm system. So we're very interested in expanding there afterward. After that, the goal is to not just do organic farming, but bring our costs down to the point where we can expand to inorganic farming as well. Organic fertilizer is sold about 5 times the price of organic or of inorganic fertilizer. So it's beneficial for us to start in the organic space, but then try to have a bigger impact as we go. This is our C-suite. 3 of our co-founders are shown here, as well as Jayesh, who joined our team last year. We've got our team in front of our building in Fremont. A number of venture capital investors and other climate tech investors have supported us. And we've been fortunate to win a number of grants and awards throughout our time as a startup. And then how we fit into the sustainable ag tech ecosystem in general, I put together this slide. There's certainly a lot more that we've already heard about, but high frequency fertigation, low greenhouse gas inputs that feed the soil, having precision ag and data feedback systems so that you know what areas of your crops are failing, perhaps adding more water or nutrients depending on the data feedback that you get. Minimizing food and bio waste. So I think a lot about sort of the input side, being in a fertilizer company, but there's a lot of companies that are trying to extend the shelf life of foods by either adding like stickers that have certain preservatives on them or things of that nature to extend shelf life and have less of our food go to the landfill once it's on the shelves. And then we've got sustainable pest and weed control. So we've got some automation, some systems that are able to laser out weeds instead of applying so many of these harmful chemicals. And we think that that's a pretty impactful thing as well. Thank you.
Wow, Josh, I think I finally understand chemistry. That was amazing. I'm really excited to learn more in the Q&A about why you chose Delhi, but maybe you could answer real quick.
And the certain areas in the Central Valley have really low cost power for California. So I think that and proximity to the farms that we're going to be supplying to.
That's great. Thank you. We're back on schedule, so we'll have plenty of time for other questions. It's my pleasure to introduce one of my very favorite faculty from University of California, Merced. Dr. Reza Asani is a professor of mechanical engineering, a pistachio grower, and an ag tech innovator. You have to see his lab. It's got every kind of crop and every kind of sensor, and he builds them himself, and he includes a lot of people from undergraduate through postdoc in the process. He is a principal investigator with the NSF Engineering Research Center Internet of Things for Ag, a very prestigious high dollar award. And then he's also on the NSF a principal investigator with NSF and USDA funded Ag Aid, or AI for Workforce Development in Agriculture. Thank you, Dr. Asani.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about AI, sensors, and robotics. And these technologies has potentially going to significantly change the way we do cropping in the future. And through this presentation, I'm going to give you some of the example of the project that I'm doing and going to show you how this technology could actually be helpful for crop production. As you know, currently we have several major challenges in crop production, including climate change, labor shortage, resource scarcity, and economic and sustainability of crop productions. So these challenges also provide an opportunity which comes from sensor technology, data-driven AI model, and autonomous platforms. And with the goal of my research has been to increase productivity, efficiency, and sustainability of crop production. I'm going to go back a little bit historic view of how this started. Late 90s, after we had invention of GPS and low-cost computers, engineers put together a system that for grain combine that was able to create a yield map. So it was basically a mass flow sensor that measured how much grain is harvested as the combine goes through the field. And the system was able actually to create what we call the yield map, right? So the yield map, as you can see in the picture, it shows the yield variability. Growers always know there's a yield variability, but this was the first time that actually we were able to quantify that yield. How much is that variability? And that was very interesting for growers, provided a very interesting question for them, because when they saw the yield variability, then the next question was, what causes the yield variability, and then how can I manage it? So that was the beginning of what we call precision agriculture, which is basically information-based management technique. So to answer the question of what causes yield variability, then we need to figure out what are the factors that affect the yield, right? So this is an example. If you look at the single plant as a factory, there are some inputs and the output is the yield. And for us, it was interesting to figure out what are those inputs. So some of these inputs like nutrients, water, pest and disease, and weeds, we were able to manage them. There are techniques to manage them. And then there are some factors that we are not able to manage, for example, climate or soil type. We couldn't manage those aspects. So now in order to, if we can quantify all these inputs, then we are able to actually now optimize the output. So then we could figure out how to maximize yield or maximize profit, depending on what your goal is. So this has started to now we have to build more sensors and more technology. And another issue that happened was how to find the relationship between these inputs and outputs. So we have multiple input independent variable, and then when yield is our dependent variable. And we usually use, all days we used to do multiple linear regression and techniques like that, which we're not able to actually find these relationships very well, because depending on what was in the model, that model was working for that particular field. And when you go to another field, it may not work. So this actually now provided for an opportunity for us to actually build more sensors. And that's what we start building a lot of different kind of sensor for different applications. I'm going to give you an example of how come this sensor could be very important for agriculture. And before joining UC Merced, I was a faculty at the University of Florida. And back in 2005, citrus industry in Florida had to face a new disease, called citrus greening or Hong Long bean. This is a bacterial disease that transmitted by an insect called psyllid, and it can go from infected trees and spread this disease to healthy trees. So the best way, this disease actually devastated citrus industry in Florida. Citrus production in Florida is 1/10 of what it was back in 2005. So over the last 20 years, this industry is pretty much wiped out in Florida, or very close to it. And we were not able to actually find good treatment for it. But the best way to deal with this disease is early detection. If we could detect this early enough, we were able to actually remove the infected trees and prevent them from spreading. So there was a lot of time and effort we put to develop different sensors and sensing technology. This was after this disease was introduced in Florida. So we worked for 6-7 years, and we looked at electromagnetic spectrum, and we looked at all the different kind of sensors that could potentially detect this disease. And in fact, the best sensor for this particular disease is a sensor that can detect at asymptomatic stage. It means very early on. Over the years, we developed and we come up with some solution. The problem was by the time we developed this sensor sensing technology, the disease spread so much that detection was not an issue, because it was a spread. It was everywhere. The disease was everywhere. So one thing we learned is that over this part of this spectrum, especially the UV visible near infrared, could be very useful, provide useful information that can help us to prevent this from happening for other crops. So one thing we did when I moved here, we start to see, can we develop a robot that continuously go and collect the data from the trees and from the leaves and look for any sign of anomaly in the leaves. And so we can actually detect this. So what we built this robotic arms, as you can see in the video, that basically goes and there is a spectrophotometer embedded in the finger of the robotic arm, and is actually collect this spectra, and it can continuously go from tree to tree and can do this continuously and collect this data. And then we create this bank of spectral data that could another program goes through it and look for any sign of anomaly. So this is an example of a spectral that this sensor could collect. So this type of technology could really help us to avoid what happened in citrus industry in Florida, because now we start looking for it in advance before the disease actually shows up on the plant. Also, 5 years ago, NSF gave us 4 universities a big fund to develop an engineering center. We call it Internet of Things for Agriculture. Any development of a sensor really is not just one person's specialty. Really, if you really want to develop something that's very useful, you need to bring people with different background to work together to develop something that is very useful and work for different conditions. And this particular group is actually, which is from University of Pennsylvania, Purdue, Merced, and University of Florida. We work together to develop this kind of sensor. I'm going to show you some of the example of the research we were doing. This one, we are working under what we call it joint ops. So we have 3 joint operation. One joint operation works on water stress detection. One joint operation works on nutrient deficiencies and nutrient detection. And then the third one works on disease detection. So there are multiple projects. This is one of the examples of the project that we were working on. The idea here is to see if we can detect and map the water stress variability in the field. All the existing irrigation schedule or water stress detections, the existing sensors that are commercially available can detect only stress in one trees. And we were trying to see, can we develop a technology that actually map the whole field so we can give a better idea of the variability of the water stress in the field, and then use that information for irrigation scheduling. So we developed a data-driven model for it, and we collect a lot of data, and we were based on some very easy to collect data, the data that comes from drones or comes from the robots on the ground. And we were able to create this map. As we start working on this technology, we also were able to actually develop a sensor that can do the water stress detection, similar to what I showed you on the robotic arm, that can actually does it very quickly and much cheaper than what's available in the market. That hopefully that will come out in the market pretty soon. Another example of the project that came out of this group is what we call it chaff sensor. These are very cheap, biodegradable sensors that you put in the ground, and it can able to monitor the parameters that you're interested. For example, what you see here is a a piece of paper that is printed with carbon, some electric diagram on it, the circuit on it, and this is covered with the beeswax, and you can just throw it in the field. As this sensor comes in contact with water, the capacitance of this sensor changes. And when you have a drones or a tractor goes on top of it, it can communicate with this and actually create a map that shows soil variability. So these are an example of, as I said, the new generation of soil moisture sensor that is biodegradable, safe to use, and also give you a high resolution variability map. There is also working on a version of it that can go under the soil using a biodegradable battery as well. So these sensors work in the growing season, and the next season you put new sets of sensor in. One more example is what we developed a sensor stack, which call it a sensor tower. This is a multiple sensor packed into one unit, and this particular one, as you go through the field, it collects a lot of data. One of the things it can do, it actually can collect, it can actually detect the fruits and localize the fruit location. So it remembers what fruit was, and you can see they put a number on every fruit and knows the exact location of this. So over the growing time, the sensor goes through the field multiple times and collect data. Over time, it can actually monitor the growth rate of every single fruit in that field. So we know how much the fruit grows. Knowing fruit growth rate is very useful information. It can give you some indication of early pest or disease problem. So this is another example. We call 4D semantic mapping. And on the labor management and augmentation part, we were looking on a technology that improved the existing machines. Like, for example, trunk shakers is a very commonly used equipment for harvesting nut trees right now. And really they are depending on a very experienced driver, because the experienced driver knows how to set different parameters of the system to avoid tree damage or maximum fruit removal. So the question is, can we make this machine smart enough that the less experienced driver operate them and still get the best fruit removal without damage to the tree? So for that, we instrument this equipment, we're collecting a lot of data, and then we feed this data into a machine learning model, which is a neural network system. And basically we find what's the optimum shaking for each tree. The optimum shaking, interestingly, for each tree is different. So every 2 trees are not the same. So hopefully this model will enable us to develop a new generation of machines that are smarter and actually can set their shaking parameters automatically. And then one more project that we are working on, and one of the speakers talked about agrovoltaic, which is more, basically dual use of land for both energy generation and also agriculture. One of the biggest issues with the existing agrovoltaic system is that they require, all this existing one required fixed structure. So you have to build some fixed structure in the farm and install your panel. Well, not many growers like that idea of having a fixed structure. So now we are talking about developing actually a mobile agrovoltaic system. Because this is a system that we are building it right now, hopefully will be operational in summer this year. And the idea is actually more useful for smaller growers that can help them to grow vegetable in summer in Central Valley when they have a very hot weather, and this technology enable us to actually grow things that we cannot grow right now. So this is another example of a technology that hopefully become more widely used. So with this, I just want to say that robotic, AI, and data model are transferring agriculture the way that unprecedented. And we expect to see some new sensor technology that's, again, is not available right now, but will be available very soon. Data-driven model is also going to change the way we use sensors and robotic in the field, and hopefully that's very, very appropriate for agricultural applications. With this, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, panel. I can't wait to dig into some more questions. Although the problems are complex, the solutions are simple. We'll be sure to leave time for audience questions. One of the first ones we discussed when we were organizing this group is kind of about the adoption, adaptation of technology for climate smart agriculture, and thinking about California's diverse cropping system as a challenge and an opportunity. Multiple crops maintain resilience for climatic and economic shocks. And so I'd love to hear what your recommendations for investment, policy, and innovation are.
So, but in fact, indeed, research and development is very costly process. And example that I gave you about citrus disease detection, it takes us several years to develop a sensor just for one crop, for one disease. And if you think about it, that in California, we have 400 different types of crops, and each one has its unique pest and disease. And if people want to work on that, it will take a long time. So that's indeed a challenge. But on the other hand, I think some of the new technology enable us to do things much faster than what we used to do. For example, detection of the fruit, I mean, identifying fruit on the tree, it used to be a very difficult task in the past, but now there are AI models that can do that much faster than what we used to do in the past. So I'm hopeful that this kind of technology enable us to move faster than what we used to do in the past.
Would you say that yours is reasonably crop agnostic? It can do many different fruit trees?
You need to train them, of course. All these AI model need training, but I think it's much easier now to train a AI model than the old-fashioned way when we did image processing.
At least for us, we've been so yeah, nitrogenous fertilizer can be used among many different crops. We've done oats and corn, as well as specialty crops, fruits, vegetables. The challenge, though, is as a startup company, you usually have a tough time competing with commodity fertilizers or any other commodities or other technologies that already exist in the market. So there's a trend basically to start with the higher value crops or crops that have more margin and work your way toward the lower crops over time. But I do think that allows us to have like a vision at least to be able to do small scale and large scale and multi-crop systems.
Josh, I also love that you highlighted all of the organizations who helped your company grow and transition into a different system. And some of those are public, some of those are private. How were you able to access those programs?
It was a lot of connections as well as reaching out. I think federal grant opportunities were huge. We got connected to Valley Ventures through kind of a conference like this. Being at Stanford and in the Valley, of course, the Silicon Valley is a ridiculous entrepreneurial environment. Everyone's trying to start a company there. So there's a pretty good entrepreneurial network to be able to get access to what are these opportunities. And then I think continuing to develop those relationships as we get grants has led to even more opportunities. So we've had internship programs with Ohlone College and Stanford and Berkeley and Fresno State, and we'll be starting some with Merced actually this summer.
I won't take up too much airspace because I know I was able to speak about kind of my idea of a moonshot, but I think just capitalizing off what Visser and Josh said is that, there is the challenge if we're going to create crop agnostic tools and the challenge of time for machine learning, then we also need to invest in a variety of systems that can support collaboration and technology transfer, knowledge adaptation on that, and also to streamline that with the real brick and mortar questions of like, what is the crop system going to need to look like? How do we make sure that crop system keeps up on par so that these machines can still match? What does that do for workers in the field? Are they impacted? How are they impacted? Because when you introduce a new tool to labor processes do change. And so a producer, particularly on a farm, is going to want to know what happens there. And I think the more we can get at in terms of articulating that and connecting those conversations together, the better off we can handle this question of time, limited resources, and the need to create something that's crop agnostic. In the field, we're largely crop specific, transfers much faster.
I also liked how you highlighted and the importance of crop commodity groups to voice their needs. And I know, Reza, you've worked across a lot of different commodity groups from figs and strawberries. How are they an important voice in the innovation space?
Well, I work with a lot of commodity groups. In fact, some of my seed grants come from commodity groups, which enable me to develop a concept and test it in the field. So I think those are very valuable. And that's the nice thing about California, that we have more options, commodity groups that leading or willing to provide funding for us.
I think there's probably a lot of audience questions. We have more too. Somebody has a mic though. Is that you, sir? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I had a question for Joshua. Is nitricity a biological process or an industrial process? And have you received National Organic Program certification for the product or not?
Yes, we have received certification. It is extracting the nutrients from almond shells, and that is essentially how we get the returning the nutrients back to the field, rather than letting almond shells go to other either landfills or other uses.
So the nitrogen is coming directly from the almond shells.
So- A
No,
portion of the nutrients we use, air, water, and the almond shells themselves are in the extraction process.
and electricity, right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's been some great investments in utilizing the waste stream for innovation, especially like Beam has an accelerator and then F3 Innovate. We are trying to work on waste, and the state's invested in food waste changes to policy, maybe not the innovation side yet. Do you either of you want to add to that?
Well, waste is a major, it is something that we need to look into. It is significant. I recently started looking into the waste we generate in the field, both in the production and the processing. The amount is significant. So if we can use that and return it back to the field, that would be very useful.
Yeah, we've
Great.
been connected with Beam as well. They've been super helpful in making connections around the valley, and yeah, generally helping us with applying to some of these grants too.
Great.
Hi, this is a question for Dr. Visser, please. I was wondering, how is it that your economic models or frameworks incorporate climate change? Is it endogenous, external, a byproduct? How do you handle climate change?
For the research that I presented here today, that's much more the ethnographic work, so it isn't really based in the quantitative ethnographic models. I can speak to a collaborative project we did funded through NSF, which was looking at water management in the Tulare Lake Basin and the impact to Sigma, and working with the hydrologists, which I'm happy to relay those papers to you because they can more clearly indicate how we handled that. But that was also built on a community modeling process to try to get at the fact of how we're actors identifying climate change in these different models. From a perspective, an economic development perspective, climate change enters in as a exogenous shock, but transformative to the internal system. So there isn't an opportunity, I mean, there isn't a discussion you have with a grower or a worker that isn't talking about different changing working conditions, managing things like water and how that can impact tech, and how do you identify data and how can you link it to sort of what is the source of that change, right? So like with censored and particularly water sensors, there's a lot of questions surrounding like, well, if we know data has been changing or the water table's changing, where do we attribute that to, and how can this data help us understand that? So from a ideological or conceptual notion, when you talk to people in the field, this is very much an endogenous factor. It's something that impacts the system incredibly. And in the models, I've seen it treated both ways across the literature. So I'm happy to talk about that more. And I will also share those papers with you if you would like that.
I think you're highlighting a need for a climate savvy workforce to be able to interpret different inputs into the system. Reza, you did the same. Could we talk briefly about what are some of the needs in the California ag tech workforce to make things like nitricity happen?
Well, I think one of the things that has been the most impactful for us is the grant awards. As you guys kind of alluded to, the VC funding is certainly pushing you to get already trained experts onto your team and go for the row crops, go for the biggest possible markets. Whereas the grants allow you to do more things like develop workforces, bring on interns to your program, train the employees that are not as experienced.
I think the technology that I was talking about is like, and you mentioned that our workforce is aging, and that's so true in here and in this. And with the new technology, we need to have new, generation of workforce that are able to use this kind of understand the technology and be able to use it in their operations.
And I think from a systems perspective, this demands new thinking. We can definitely engage our K-12 system and our formal educational system, but we also have to consider the non-traditional pathways. So we may be talking about certification programs at 3, 4, 6-week intervals. We may be talking about capitalizing off grower associations and worker meetings to create new continuing education credits. And I think there's 2 key points that you put, Reza. We have to not only train this workforce how to use these tools, but also to understand the data that comes from it, and also somehow translate that innate internal knowledge that many of our farmers and producers who have worked in this field for years know, so that the next generation coming up can take that innate knowledge to look at this data and be like, that's what it is. And that's the question. If AI can encapsulate that generational knowledge, then we will crack this code. So far it has not, and that will be the missing piece for California.
Importance of existing ag expertise in interpreting even the most AI generated information. We were fortunate to host the statewide director for 4-H, and she said she wants to create more classes where 4-H goes to the students. She wants them microdosing ag tech. That was her word, not mine. And thinking of these short interventions with the food system to get people excited about ag and technology. We always want to bring the robotics club and the FFA kids together to see what kind of monstrous solution they come up with. I'm going to turn to my friend, Mr. Wright in the back.
Thank you, Leah, for putting this together. I have an easy question and one maybe not as easy. I'd hate to sound so ignorant, but do you have to use organic almond hulls to make do they have to be an organic crop in order to continue?
Currently, that is what we have certified, but we don't believe that is a long-term requirement. As long as you can prove that the shells were not treated in some bad way, then we should be able to use inorganic as well.
Okay, my second question is looking at, and I did a little bit more on the water side, the policy and Sigma. One of the big fears out there I keep hearing over and over again is that the next legislature is going to continue to try to rewrite it in its own image. And so the goalposts are continually moving. Do you see that as something in your facet that you're dealing with? And how would you deal with that?
Yes. So having done research both on Sigma as a policy and sort of agricultural stakeholders' responses to Sigma for Degrees for 6 years, and also looking at the ag tech space, that is the challenge, right? These goalposts keeping moving at their own pace. But I think that links to the importance of what we're trying to do in our work in LACA and also F3, trying to link the ecological and the technical and these policy measures to the social and the institutional realities that exist. And that requires, from a social science perspective, getting boots on the ground onto these workplaces, articulating what the experience is up and matching that with these broad models and factors. It's hard work. It's tough work. It's not necessarily work that gets recognized very often. But I think one thing we've played around with in the UC system is, could we leverage our extension services to begin to do this and to try to relate to policymakers like, sure, that's a good goalpost, but let's show what the realities are, right? Because let's be honest, policies have consequences, intended and unintended. And when you try to affect change in rural economies or change a way of doing a system that has been in place for a long time, this does present risks to residents and to actors in the area and there are costs, and we have to, as government systems, as public institutions, we have to be good at articulating the needs and the realities across the board. Essentially, and this is kind of just academic speak, but it's how do you create these systems to also be flexible, to relay this information up, to create these new technologies. And one example I'll give is, we always talk about return on investment as being like the point in which growers will adopt a technology, right? It'll meet the price point of labor. Well, all you need is one change in minimum wage laws or anything like that to suddenly take off the ROI. And if you don't understand that, and then sort of how you're addressing innovation and economic development as a system will ultimately possibly miss a good technology that's going to come in for the industry. Or worse, you have now inserted unintended consequences to the economic model and return on these technologies. So it requires a new way of thinking. It requires a pragmatic and realistic, aligned with some vision of what we want these tools to do. I think we may still be trying to figure out what that is. But I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I totally agree. Just the example you gave us, it's about increasing minimum wage or availability of labor or not availability. In fact, is a roller coaster for us as a scientist, because let's say we are developing a robot for pruning, and then when the labor availability constantly change and the price more change, it's very hard to develop a technology that actually become commercially available, because it may not be cost effective if the value is changing constantly.
Would a minimum wage increase help or hurt automation? I think it
Actually
probably
helps.
So I'll use my own example in Madera County. The demographics is the things that we don't look at, right? So let's just take the demographics of farmers in Madera County. 650 family farmers from 5 acres to 500. The next stack of family farmers is from 500 to 4,500. And the last set of farmers are 13 management companies that are from 4,500 to 20,000. Unfortunately, their use of resource is only to farm investors, right? So as a family farmer, I struggle to compete on a yield perspective because I actually have to pay my bills with yield, right? And that's an important, and that's where Sigma's really been a problem, is because most of the folks that are in the white area are actually large corporate entities, right? So we've got to get our arms around that. But the worst enemy we have in our own community is our adjoining community, our farmers, right? So data is factual. Models aren't working in Madera County. So I just wanted to.
Thank you for adding to the conversation. And I think the next panel is going to dive deeply into Sigma. It kind of has to here. I feel like Sigma and shifting baselines is part of our psychological problem, that we expect less and less, and we should be expecting more, and taking Dr. Asani's word that all of these problems create solutions and there's opportunities to adapt. It's just, how do we reduce the barriers to our adaptation and get out of our own way? And I think that's going to take a lot of collaboration across farmers and all of the organizations that support them. I would love to thank our panel. I learned so much. Thank you. And thanks again to the Stanford and our friends at Fresno State and the Maddie Institute. Thank you all.